It bothers me when people call games they dislike repetitive. Pretty much all games are repetitive. Whether you're playing a city builder or a shooter or a racing game, they're all extremely repetitive. Whether or not we actually find them repetitive is tempered by how much we enjoy them. But there are certain games that rely on the absence of repetition in order to remain challenging or enjoyable, like puzzle games. The same puzzle repeated over and over, obviously that's not a challenge, and it's through the challenge that enjoyment is derived in puzzle games. And that's the problem with the ball. It does dabble in diversity a little, but for the most part, it's a few simple challenges repeated over and over again for 6 hours. You play as an archaeologist who's found himself stuck underground, and rather than wait to be rescued by your team, you explore the cavern. You quickly find some kind of weapon, which as it happens controls the ball, and shortly thereafter you find the ball itself. You then travel through a number of chambers, solving puzzles that require manipulation of the ball in order to progress. The game tells a sort of story of the creatures that created the ball and their interactions with early Mesoamerican humans, but there must be no more than 2 minutes of dialogue in the whole game. It's very sparse. Similarly, the way you just start and pick up the gun and ball right away and then work your way through a bunch of puzzles with no explanation. It feels like something from 1995. The game goes halfway with its real-world believability, and that sort of thing is all or nothing, making the ball ultimately feel like an abstract puzzle game in the vein of Lemmings or Braid, which is definitely at odds with its first-person perspective. The gun that you use to manipulate the ball, if you care to call it a gun, has two functions, push and pull. The pull function creates some sort of force that pulls the ball towards you, even if you don't have line of sight on it, which is very useful, but the ball doesn't have a mind of its own or anything, so it won't navigate around obstacles. Taking your ball around the environment is pretty hassle-free, but you can expect to spend most of the time holding the pull button. A toggle feature would have been handy. The push function, which definitely doesn't look like a sex toy when it's charging up, requires direct contact with the ball, as it's pretty much a hammer, which is just awesome. The ball is huge and heavy, and punching it around with the sex toy hammer gun is very satisfying. The idea of gravity manipulation in games has gotten away from the pure, simple pleasure of smacking stuff, and it's very cool the way the ball has brought the two together. Each level is split down into a number of locked-off chambers, and the objective in each is typically to press all the switches in the area. That's not always the case, but it is most of the time. There are two types of switches, those activated by the player and those activated by the ball. The game naturally starts off very simple, basic platforming, dragging and punching the ball around, hitting switches. Now and then you might be separated from your ball, or you may have to, say, jump on top of it to reach a higher area, but it doesn't really get any more complex than that. It's a fine tutorial area, but as you play through it, something gradually becomes apparent. It isn't ending. It just keeps on going. Right around the point that you've pretty much mastered the basics of ball punching and button pushing, just as you're ready for the game to introduce new elements and build on the foundation with new puzzles, the game keeps on doing what it's been doing. This is the problem with the ball. Imagine if every puzzle in Lemmings was based around the umbrella guy and the ladder guy. Within half an hour you'd be pretty much sick of it. And then imagine if it lasts 4.5 hours. Lemmings does of course have about 15 different lemmings, which facilitate many different puzzles. And all other excellent puzzle games like World of Goo, Braid, Winterbottom, they all introduce new elements that affect gameplay and facilitate new and different puzzles. The tragedy of the ball is that it does dabble in just such ideas. Things like lighting the ball on fire, electrocuting the ball, magnets that steal your ball away from you, attaching objects to the ball to drag them around, the ball being the only light source in the area, and the ball creating a low gravity field around itself. These are all very interesting ideas, but the game barely uses them. You tragically simply spend most of your time running over switches. Now that's not to say all the puzzles are bad, some are really quite good, feeling a little Rube Goldberg-esque, but there's a dire lack of creativity in the puzzle design, and it's especially tragic as those creative ideas are in the game, they just aren't really used all that much. When you're not hitting switches, you're usually fighting. The levels are inhabited by undead enemies, of the arm flailing and fireball throwing varieties. There are also some giant insect creatures, but not many. You aren't armed of course, except for your ball. Your ball is both your shield and your sword, as it were. You can use it to keep enemies away from you, and to block fireballs, and you can also use it to crush anything that gets near you. This keeps you pretty much in the thick of the combat all the time during fights, which is really quite intense, and crushing enemies is super satisfying. But there's also something that completely moots the combat. Checkpoints. When you die, you simply respawn very close to where you died, and of full health, with whatever enemies you killed prior to dying still dead. This makes the combat simple enough to the point of triviality. There's never an issue of whether or not you're going to survive an encounter, you can simply spam your way through every fight. Something a lot of modern games don't seem to appreciate anymore is that for there to be any satisfaction in victory, there must be the possibility of failure. By completely removing that possibility of failure from the game, they undermine the point of success, making the combat little more than a minor hindrance, rather than an actual challenge to be overcome. If this isn't the sort of thing that bothers you, you'll find the boss combat to be both intense and satisfying, albeit a little rough. While the level designs are of the corridor leading into chamber leading into corridor variety, the environments themselves are absolutely gorgeous. It's running in UE3, which I know a lot of people hate it, but it is a good looking engine, and it's pretty well used in the ball. You travel through buildings of stone, wood and metal, through caverns, and skirt beside lava flows and waterfalls. It is on occasion truly breathtaking. The Mesoamerican art style is also beautiful and almost singularly unique, with Azteca and perhaps only a couple of Tomb Raider levels being the only other games I've played with such an art style. So visually it is a very interesting game. There are occasions where the game becomes a bona fide platformer, and this is actually where the game is probably at its finest. Jumping around avoiding lava or electrocuted water, while also manoeuvring the ball at the same time, is really quite thrilling. Particularly as, unlike combat, dying and returning to the checkpoint means starting over, which creates some risk versus reward. It makes me think the game would have been far more interesting with some Prince of Persia style traps. The game does have environmental dangers like lava and spike pits, but the game doesn't really take the idea further. There are actually some landmines in the latter stages of the game, but these are easily just popped with your ball. The ball has a very solid foundation of platforming and puzzle solving and combat, but foundations exist to be built upon, and this is where the ball falls short. With a focus more on those cool twists that facilitate different styles of puzzles, perhaps some real traps or a more played up platforming element, and of course some combat that is more than simply a triviality, the ball would have been something really quite special. As it is, it's just okay.